Hey folks, before we dive in, just a quick reminder to stay informed with S News. If you want to catch this video and all our future updates, go ahead and support us by subscribing, liking, and commenting. It really helps us out and keeps you in the loop. Trump is furious with Putin, and it might change the war. US President Donald Trump is extremely angry with Vladimir Putin, something the Russian leader never saw coming. Putin thought he could pressure Trump into backing down, but he was totally wrong. So what happened? Trump just lashed out at Putin with a powerful double blow that's putting massive pressure on the Russian leader to end the war in Ukraine. This combination of actions could be the key to stopping the conflict. On July 14th, Trump announced that the US is preparing two major moves that could seriously damage Russia. First, blow a NATO deal. The first part involves NATO. The US has pledged to work closely with NATO to supply advanced weapons to Ukraine whenever needed. In other words, Ukraine is about to get everything it needs to fight back, thanks to the US and its NATO allies. As if that wasn't enough to rattle Putin, Trump also gave him a 50-day ultimatum: reach a peace deal, or the US will crush Russia's economy with harsh secondary tariffs. That's huge. It's not just about the actions themselves, they're tough enough. What really stings for Putin is the message behind them. Whatever relationship he thought he had with Trump is now falling apart. No more manipulation, no more lies. Trump has drawn a clear line in the sand and is telling Putin to comply with what the US wants, or face the consequences. Let's break down what these consequences could look like, starting with the new NATO deal. Why all this now? Because NATO has agreed to raise the recommended defense spending for its members to 5% of their GDP. This decision was made on June 25th during the NATO summit in The Hague, under what's being called the Hague Defense Investment Plan. Rutte praised the decision, calling it a game-changer for our collective defense, according to the US Department of Defense. He added that NATO is now building a stronger, fairer, and more powerful alliance. Trump emphasized that the extra money should go to the best military equipment, ideally made in the US, which he called the best in the world. It's unclear if NATO members will buy exclusively from the US, but Trump's concerns about NATO's spending seem to have been addressed. He has repeatedly questioned US participation in NATO, citing lack of fair cost sharing. Back in March, he even said the US might not defend NATO allies who don't pay their share. But with the 5% commitment, NATO seems to have listened to Trump's demands. This is a big deal for Ukraine and a major blow to Putin. However, there are some caveats. First, the 5% figure is only a recommendation. NATO won't force members to hit that target if they can't afford it. Even the US only spent 3.4% of its GDP on defense in 2024, about the same as Estonia, and less than Poland's 4.1%. Still, the point isn't necessarily to hit 5% exactly. It's to show commitment and take Trump's concerns seriously. Some NATO countries like Spain have pushed back. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez called the 5% goal unrealistic, saying it would take money away from vital public services. Experts like Fenella McGurty from the International Institute for Strategic Studies say governments will need strong public messaging to justify this level of defense spending. There's also the issue of national debt. Many NATO members are already deeply in debt. Poland, for example, has debt equal to 55.3% of its GDP, even though it's close to the 5% goal. Other countries are worse off. Greece at 153.6%, the UK at 101.8%, and France at 113%. That raises questions about whether NATO countries can realistically hit the spending target without making their debt problems worse. Defense is expensive, and NATO is now telling its members that it's time to pay up. For Trump, that's enough, and for Ukraine, it's great news. The 5% pledge has cleared the way for Trump's first hard strike against Putin's regime. As for how the deal works, it starts with assessing Ukraine's needs. According to Euromaidan Press, NATO will now work closely with President Volodymyr Zelensky and his team to figure out which weapons are most urgently needed. Air defense is priority number one, but we'll soon see what other kinds of weapons start arriving in Ukraine as a result of the new deal. As Rutte put it after Trump's announcement, "If I were Vladimir Putin right now, I'd start taking peace negotiations very seriously. This NATO move alone might be enough to make Putin reconsider his strategy." But the real pressure comes from Trump's tariff threat. Trump hasn't announced the tariffs yet, but he gave Putin a very clear warning. Make peace within 50 days or face serious consequences. Sky News reported that during a White House meeting with Rutte, Trump said he was extremely dissatisfied with Russia and was considering 100% tariffs as part of a sweeping crackdown. But these wouldn't be regular tariffs on Russian goods. Trump is planning secondary sanctions, which means any country that does business with Russia could be punished. Here's how it works, according to the BBC. If a country like India keeps buying oil from Russia, then American companies buying Indian products would have to pay a 100% import tax. That would make those goods way too expensive, so US companies would likely buy from somewhere else. This would cause major economic pain for India and others still dealing with Russia. In the past, the US imposed a 25% secondary tariff on any country that bought oil from Venezuela, whether directly or through third parties. And that's exactly the kind of thing that has Putin worried now. He's been able to keep selling oil to countries like China and India by using a shadow fleet of ships that disguise the origin of the oil, making it seem like it's being shipped from somewhere else. But that trick won't work under Trump's proposed secondary sanctions. If Trump goes through with it, any country that welcomes one of Putin's shadow fleet vessels could face serious financial penalties. If these penalties keep piling up, countries might decide it's just not worth the risk to keep doing business with Russia, dealing a blow to Putin's war effort. At least that's the idea. So, why hasn't the US just slapped direct tariffs on Russia already? There are a few good reasons. According to Russia Matters, one reason Trump didn't hit Russia with direct tariffs, while imposing them on almost everyone else back in April, is because of the existing sanctions. The research group Castellum.ai reports that the US already has 7,384 sanctions in place against Russia, 6,433 of which came after the invasion of Ukraine. The US says these sanctions have already brought trade with Russia to a near standstill, and that's largely true. According to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, trade between the U.S. and Russia was just $3.5 billion in 2024. That's tiny for two of the world's largest economies. Of that, $3 billion were Russian imports to the U.S., a 34.2% drop from the previous year. So the argument goes, why bother with direct tariffs if there's barely any trade left to tax? Russia Matters also points to another possible reason. The U.S. might still be hoping Russia returns to the global economy someday, but only if Putin agrees to at least a ceasefire and puts Russia on the road to full peace with Ukraine. If that happens, the U.S. wouldn't want to be stuck with tariffs it would then have to remove later. Either way, Trump's tariff threat sends a very clear message. If Putin doesn't cooperate, the U.S. will squeeze the Russian economy even harder. The BBC reports that oil and gas sales account for around one-third of Russia's national income and more than 60% of its exports. These sales are crucial for Putin. In 2024, Russia made $108 billion from oil and gas exports, a 26% increase from 2023, according to Reuters. That's a huge chunk of change fueling his war machine. But in 2025, those revenues have started to drop. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air says Russia's earnings fell 18% year-on-year in the second quarter of 2025, even though it exported 8% more oil and gas. So even though they're selling more, they're making less, and Putin can't afford another hit to his energy exports. The Atlantic Council calls this Russia's critical vulnerability. In November 2024, they pointed out that Russia's ability to continue its brutal military campaign in Ukraine depends heavily on revenue from fossil fuel exports. Again, that one-third of the budget figure comes up, with the Council warning that cutting off that money could be a knockout blow. To fight inflation, Russia's central bank recently hiked interest rates to 21%. War costs and sanctions are only making things worse. The Council said if energy exports drop even further, Putin could be forced to choose between continuing the war and avoiding economic collapse. Right now, Russia's interest rate is at 20%, still extremely high, and if Trump follows through with secondary tariffs, it will only add more pressure. These measures may not stop big players like China, which has already shown it's willing to fight back with its own tariffs. But smaller nations might start looking for safer trade partners. Putin won't lose all his oil and gas revenue, but he could lose enough to feel the financial squeeze, especially since Russia is already hurting. Now, Why is Trump's announcement such a big deal? First, it's about tone. The BBC noted that Trump did hint during his White House announcement that Ukraine shares some blame for the war, which, echoes his earlier controversial views. But this time he focused most of his frustration on Putin, and specifically on how the Russian leader talks one way and acts another. Trump said he and Putin speak regularly and talk a lot about getting this done when it comes to a peace deal. But then right after these chats, Putin launches more airstrikes on Ukraine. Trump said, after 3 or 4 times, you realize talk doesn't mean anything. He added, I don't want to call him a killer, but he's a tough guy. He's fooled a lot of people over the years, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, but he didn't fool me. This kind of direct talk might rattle Putin. He doesn't want Trump to start calling him untrustworthy. That could open the door to even more U.S. actions that harm Russia's war effort. Still, Trump's announcement also raised eyebrows for another reason. It might not have been as strong as expected. He teased a major announcement about Russia a week before unveiling this double strike, but some analysts say it fell short. CBC's Briar Stewart wrote on July 14th that giving Putin 50 days to agree to a ceasefire isn't exactly the dramatic punishment many expected. That's more than a month for Putin to weaken Ukraine's position through more airstrikes, or to try to sway Trump away from his current stance. John Hardy, director of the Russia program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, told Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty that Trump is heading in the right direction, but questioned why Putin is being given more time. Putin has made it clear he's not serious about negotiating, so I don't know why Trump is still waiting. Maybe the most telling reactions are coming from Russian investors and insiders. According to Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, Russia's main stock market, the Moscow Exchange, rose by 2.7% after Trump's announcement. That suggests investors were expecting harsher, faster penalties and were relieved by the softer approach. So far, the Kremlin has remained silent, but Sergei Markov, a former Putin advisor and now pro-Kremlin analyst, is already calling Trump's tariff threat a bluff. He also claimed Trump had abandoned trying to bring peace to Ukraine. Whether that's truly what the Kremlin believes is unclear. Markov likely has a direct line to Putin, and it's possible the Kremlin approved his words to downplay Trump's threats while keeping Putin looking strong at home. It's even possible we're watching a bluff of a bluff, with the Kremlin using Markov to act unimpressed by Trump, hoping to discourage escalation. Regardless, Trump's announcement is significant. Now the clock is ticking. We'll have to wait 50 days to see whether Trump follows through with those secondary tariffs. In the meantime, the US and NATO are moving forward, working together to get more weapons to Ukraine to defend against Putin's relentless airstrikes. That's very bad news for Russia. Their summer offensive relies heavily on drones and missiles. But the big question is, will any of this be enough to bring Putin to the negotiating table? Time will tell. And meanwhile, Russia's navy is in serious trouble, and Putin may not be able to save it. Finally, thanks for listening to S News. If you found this video helpful or interesting, please subscribe, like, and comment below. Don't forget to follow S News for more updates, and yeah, stay tuned for our future